No, that's under My Griffith, I think. You know the My Griffith? Yeah. So you can check your timetable. But everyone's different because we couldn't fit them all in the same room. So they're on at different times in different rooms. Not here, no. They had an assignment due, so they're taking the day off. They probably need their sleep. Okay, so I might make a start. We've got a lot of material to get through. I should apologise on behalf of Learning at Griffith. The lecture slides have been popping in and out all morning. So if you weren't able to download your lecture slides, it's okay. Feel free to print them afterwards. This first part will be covering future of testing and assessment, and we'll also be doing just a review of course. So I'm going to do the review of course first, just so I can get that out of the way. But the future of testing and assessment, that will be accessible. There are exam questions on it, so keep that in mind, please. All right. Now, attendance is a little light today, so I'm guessing there were a few people that pulled an all-nighter and they desperately need their sleep. So no judgment here, but for those playing at home, we're just going to go through a review of the course. All right, so what is psychological assessment and why does it matter? In the early weeks, we covered the purposes of psychological assessment and how it's broader than just administering a test. Care must be taken by you, the future professional, to select the right test. So the things that you look at are things like psychometric soundness, reliability, validity, ease of scoring, can it be computer administered, doesn't need to be face-to-face, those sorts of utility questions. And of course, when you do an assessment as opposed to a test, it involves establishing a rapport because self-disclosure is pretty difficult to some random stranger that you've never met before. The other advantage, of course, of face-to-face assessment is that you get to observe what we call extra test behaviour. And it's a pretty crucial concept. You don't get that with an online administered survey. So I can't tell when you're completing the survey if you're motivated, if you're even reading the questions. So those sorts of issues, you can actually, observe their extra test behaviour, see if they're paying attention, and generally having a presence that actually improves the reliability if it's supervised. Now, for most students, psychological assessment is the first real opportunity you've had to play with actual psychological tests. Up till now, we've given you the data file, it's already scored, and you're looking at the correlation or maybe an ANOVA or a t-test. But now in this course, you've actually learned how to do the scoring, and it's a really valuable job skill. So you've seen how it's scored and then how it can be evaluated with test norms. Now, when performing statistical analyses, you were assigned data sets before. Now you know how to gather them. So that's useful in whatever profession you go off to. Even if you decide not to become a psychologist, it's useful to actually be able to score psychological tests. So you're now capable of administering and scoring tests like the DAS-21, the Beck Depression Inventory, maybe a general personality like the TIPI, things like that. And they're useful skills. If you read a report from a psychologist, you can interpret it. You know what the T-score means, what a Z-score of 2.4 means, or if someone's in the 70th percentile. You're also capable of interpreting those sort of statistic things like a confidence interval, the reliability in percentiles. So you won't be bamboozled by some psychologist writing a really technical report. You've also learned how to determine psychometric soundness. So reliability is an important prerequisite, but it doesn't guarantee a good test. It just gets you in the door. So validity is far more important. So that's how the test performs. Does it predict behaviour? Does it have criterion validity? Is it consistent to other similar tests? Convergent validity. And does it relate to other psychological constructs? That's what we call construct validity. And of course the other question is norms. When evaluating a client on a psychological test, you know that we compare them to other participants who have also sat the test, to a normative sample. And if you want to make a diagnosis, a hiring decision, it's important that the normative sample is representative of the general population and sufficiently sized. You can use the percentile, the T-score, the Z-score, or even a nominal label like above average or below average. But not all norms are created equal. So if your normative sample is flawed, then so too will be your conclusions. If it's not a representative sample, it's a convenient sample, that is one limitation of interpretation. Now, your assignment gave you practical experience with the test development process. That's our primary learning objective. It's not so much about the grade that you receive for the assignment, it's about the skills that you've learned and those learning outcomes. So you now understand that even with the very best of intentions, the most skillful of writing, and I did see some very cleverly written items in consults, not every test item is going to survive. Also, that testing is an iterative process, often with many cycles. So that's why we release newer versions of tests to refine them over time. But it doesn't stop with the scale development paper. You have ongoing evaluation of tests through things like factor analysis, different samples, further construct validity. And sometimes you may call into question the validity of existing tests. So you can't always believe what you read on a scale development paper. Go read subsequent ones, see if there's any flaws, kick the tyres, because quite often that initial scale development paper will be glowing, but then for whatever reason it doesn't replicate. Then we came to intelligence. Now, intelligence is one of those concepts that we all think we know, but it's really hard to describe. Like the proverbial blind men with the elephant, we each see different parts. So laypersons think differently about intelligence to experts. There's many different theories on the nature and structure of intelligence. A review of this material, and this is as subtle as I can get, would be highly desirable. The technique of factor analysis is commonly employed here to settle debates about the structure of intelligence and to test hypotheses and make arguments. But of course there is no consensus and the debate rages on. Now remember psychometric G? That refers to the shared variance across intelligence tests. It's sometimes referred to as fluid intelligence, but there's also a crystallised component as well that falls under G. So some researchers will argue that it's just measuring fluid intelligence and it's less influenced by educational experiences. Hereditary and genetics are strongly influential. But we know too that environment makes a big contribution. And the strongest factor of all, of course, is socioeconomic status. Where you live, what are your parents like, their level of education, what type of environment are you growing up in, and also the prenatal care as well, because that affects intelligence as well. And there's often a failure to consider this in debates about group differences. We do know, though, there's no gender differences in general intelligence, or G, but that males rate their intelligence as higher than females. There's also appreciable gender differences in visual, spatial and verbal ability. Men tend to do better on visual spatial tasks in general, but there are always exceptions. And women tend to do considerably better on tasks of verbal ability, particularly reading and writing, grammar, punctuation, spelling, verbal fluency. So there's a whole lot of tasks that fall under that. So that was about the gender difference in reading and writing. Okay. Now, we've got little Bart there saying we do need no education. You know the old Pink Floyd song, we don't need no education. We don't need no thought control. Well, I forgot to put that in there. When we're doing a psychological assessment in an educational setting, almost always by referral, unless we're going out doing like a mass screening, and it's to address school or parental concerns. Either is valid, but often we have teachers saying, oh, Johnny has a behaviour problem, or Jane can't read, or something like that. So it's often the teacher that first flags it, the parent follows up with a psychological assessment. And of course we do use standardised testing as well. It's commonly employed by educators, initially developed often by psychologists, but administered by educators. Now there's arguments for and against it by parents, teachers and policymakers. Now to give you an example that's probably fresh in everyone's mind, if you've got a child, we're talking about things like NAPLAN. But we're also talking about things like PISA and TIMS and, the core skills tests that we do for graduation. Now, assessment is often used for determining eligibility for services and for making determinations about how effective an educational intervention has been. And we often employ the response to intervention model on page 323, where teachers provide instruction, student learning is evaluated, we offer the intervention, and then we retest it. So I'll give you a case study. Little Johnny is generally bright, happy and confident. And his teachers say he has a natural gift for most subjects. However, his reading is significantly below the level of his classmates. So you've got some student learning being evaluated there by the teacher. Johnny is screened, identified as having dyslexia, and then he's provided with remedial intervention for reading. And we target things like phonological coding, so spelling out your words, and giving him practice reading out aloud. That's your intervention. Several months later, though, Johnny's reevaluated, and a decision is made whether he needs further assistance or whether the problem is starting to resolve itself. So that's a good example of the types of educational assessments you might do. Another approach is dynamic assessment, which is ongoing. So you can see that on page 325. Then we've got national and international assessments like PISA and NAPLAN. In education, we often employ these standardised tests, not to measure individual students, but to measure groups, classes, schools, districts, states, and of course the country. And we can examine different groups, so the difference between Indigenous learning outcomes and non-Indigenous, between rural and city students, between males and females on things like reading or mathematics. We also compare Australia versus international. So national testing is controversial. Why? Because of the pressure it puts on teachers and then the pressure that puts on the poor little students. International assessments have seen a decline in reading, mathematics and science, consistent with most other OECD nations. But most Asian nations have actually seen an increase. So that's why we're hearing talk about school funding. It's not out of the goodness of the government's heart, but it's because of economic pragmatism. We need a literate, not just reading and writing, but a mathematic and scientifically literate workforce. Now, personality, like intelligence, the structure of personality is debatable. Is it 3 factors like Eisnick suggested? Is it 5 like Costa and McRae? Or is it 6 like the 6-factor personality questionnaire? So that honesty, humility is a new one that's been postulated. And then there's a 16-factor personality model. Again, we're using things like factor analysis to make these arguments and debates. It can also be used to measure a specific set of attributes, so a specific trait, like you did in your assignment. So not one of the big 5, but, you know, a unidimensional trait. Or even temporary states. So how are you feeling today? If you've handed your assignment in, I'm going to guess pretty good. If you haven't, and hopefully you've got an extension or at least applied for one, then you might be feeling a little anxious. But in 3 months, that'll be gone. So it's a temporary state. Most frequently used method is the self-report. Who better knows your inner life than you? It's good for research and assessment of groups, but it may be subject to biases and response styles for individuals. In clinical settings, we might also employ projective testing as an alternative. So what we did last week. In cases where a person lacks insight, mentally ill, or perhaps in children, we can also use the informant report. Another alternative, which we covered very heavily last week, is behavioural assessment. It can be a checklist of observed behaviour, but it could also be self-monitoring. So that's where we get you to do the evaluation, and we get you to do it either at specified times or we have it randomly selected, and maybe your smartphone will go off and ask you how you're doing. So experience sampling. Might get you to record a mood diary if you're working with a client and doing CBT to identify those negative cognitions that seem to be cropping up. Then we have the psychophysiological. So we've talked about biofeedback, where you actually provide feedback on biological processes, but also the idea of unobtrusive or non-reactive measures. So if I'm just going to pick on anyone, Matt, if I'm watching everything you're doing, everything you're saying, and it's for a job interview, he's going to put his best foot forward, isn't he? No, he's going to wear a suit and tie, he's going to dress up, he'll be nice and friendly. If I ask, can you do this type of job, he'll say, yes, of course I can do that type of job. You know, but people are monitored, so they alter their behaviour. Whereas if I measured your heart rate while I was asking you a question, or I hooked up to your little fingers a polygraph machine, so we're measuring galvanic skin response, that would be very hard to lie. Unfortunately, though, there's that false positive effect where, you know, just due to anxiety, it looks like someone's being deceptive. So they're not always perfect, but they do provide an additional source of information. And we also introduced you to the concept of a personality disorder. So this cluster of maladaptive personality traits. Cluster A covers thought disorders, so odd or eccentric, like paranoia. B is relationships with others, emotional, erratic. And cluster C covers some quite debilitating socio-emotional disorders. So they're anxious, they're fearful, they're dependent on others, or they're too shy, so avoidant. But a lot of people have criticised them, and you can read in the textbook some of those criticisms and go back to the lecture. There's strong comorbidity, so diagnosis is based on behavioural observation is difficult because you don't always display that behaviour. So in a clinical setting, you know, trying to pin someone down, is it this condition or that? That's a harder thing to do. And so clinicians often disagree, just because different behaviour has been shown during the session. It's also not always stable over time. And there's claims of gender bias by Kaplan and others, especially for things like dependent personality disorder. You know, if a wife or a husband says, I can't live without my partner, does that make them mentally ill, or are they just in love? You know, no man is an island unto himself. So there are questions about the validity of some of these claims. Now, you may get a very different perspective if you're doing 3009, but you should at least be, I'm not trying to sell you on one or the other, but you should at least be aware of some of the controversies. All right, now that brings us to the future of testing and psychological assessment. Okay, let's get that one running. All right, so this is always a fun lecture to deliver because a lot of the stuff and a lot of the content is new. Things have changed, even in the space of 12 months since I last delivered it. So I actually spent quite a few days updating this because there's some really cool advancements that just weren't available or were, you know, really in their infancy last year. And we've already seen substantial changes. So it sort of blends technology a little bit and psychology and psychological assessment all into one. So we'll cover the future of tests and assessment, some technical and methodological developments, and some new technologies that are leading to new types of assessment. Then we'll go through the exam, and by the way, in the tutorials this week, there'll be a practice exam for you to go through. I'll put the answers up in a couple of days, just so you're not tempted to peek. But if you are going to tutorials this week, then you can test your knowledge there. Okay, so what factors have influenced test development up till now? Well, there have been a lot of theoretical developments. So things like the structure of intelligence, the structure of personality factor analysis. So what have we learned since Binet? How has personality expanded? And I went through that in earlier in the lecture. Then there's technical and methodological advancements. So statistics. We had the t-test and we had the correlation, but then we learnt factor analysis. And people like Spearman actually had to develop those statistical techniques that are fiendishly complicated to do by hand, but now you can do effortlessly with SPSS. Then there was computers and the internet. So that led to things like experience sampling, like I mentioned with smartphones, and self-monitoring. It also led to online data collection. And of course, there have been social factors that are driving test development. So political factors, like the impact of world wars. That's why we have intelligence tests. You know, the Army Alpha and Beta test was the most widely administered intelligence test for many, many decades. We had things like the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery. Again, it's widely used, but developed initially for military applications. And then we have funding and policy factors like educational testing, driving test development as well. So, if we were to get out our crystal balls and look forward into the future, what sort of factors and influences will impact testing? Well, we're likely to see expanded coverage of intelligence testing, and in particular specific tests of cognitive ability. You know, things like Gardner's and emotional intelligence, we're likely to see a lot more of that. There'll be new aspects of personality not yet examined. I mentioned one of the limitations of factor analysis is that it can only analyse the questions you put into it. So if you haven't thought to ask those questions, it will not identify that as a factor. So there are emerging personality traits that just haven't even been deeply examined. So there's an opportunity, if you like the idea of research, to maybe go in and examine some of these things. We've got one student here who picked as one of their topics a very interesting psychological drive, the need for cognition, which is a very important drive for some people, for others maybe a little bit less. But there are likely other drives and needs we've still to identify that researchers can expand upon. So there's a lot of opportunities to make contributions to the literature. More and more too, we're looking at positive psychology. Instead of the depression and the anxiety and the sadness and the cruelty and the prejudice, we look at the happier, rosier side of life. So that's something that's still emerging, and again, lots of opportunities for contributions. We're likely to have new ways to measure psychological states and personality traits. Now, I've got there a picture of an EEG cap. If anyone's ever actually had an EEG, you'll know that they dip it in salty water because that conducts electricity, and you sit there with a wet beanie on your head. The other option is that they put little sticky gel and lots of little sensors on your head. Either way, not real pleasant, not real practical. But imagine if you could have a device that you could wear like your glasses that could achieve the same thing. You could measure an awful lot of psychological state data, track your mood fluctuations. People already do it with a Fitbit, their movement and their exercise. It's very likely that psychology will become trendy and it'll be the next consumer product. Then there's social phenomena. We're growing up in a digital age, so we're different from the previous generations. We've got new issues to grapple, like privacy. If someone told you that the government was listening to their phone calls and that all their messages and their letters were being opened and inspected, you'd think they're paranoid, crazy. But yet we know that to be the truth today. Most phone call, anything that goes over international certainly is already scanned for voice print identification. So emails can be routinely scanned for certain keywords. So growing up in that age, someone who was on the borderline of being paranoid could very easily tip over into the full-blown paranoia. We have to deal with things like Tinder, Twitter, online bullying from our president, Snapchat. For those of you who don't know, Snapchat is one of those things where you can send a photo, supposedly it's erased, but of course you could take a photo again or a screenshot. So then people share a photo temporarily, but it ends up getting put on the internet or shared around. And the pessimistic view is that there will be political changes and there will be war. So that will drive test development again. Particularly for personality, we want to identify who is likely to crack under pressure, who is likely to perform well, and we want to know, and this is a very cynical view, but that's what the Army Alpha Beta test was about, who will go to the front line and who will be safe back at base. So they're likely to drive the future of testing as well. So content development. Remember, a construct is a hypothetical entity with theoretical links to other hypothesized variables. It should, ideally, predict observable behaviours or thoughts or feelings. So we're going to see theoretical advances like new constructs being examined. And we'll probably see new types of tests and test procedures. I'm going to show you a couple of them today, later on in the lecture. But let's have a look at some emerging constructs. Now, I'm hoping this will play without advertising. We'll see.
Smarty pants, egghead, brainiac. You've heard terms like these before. Maybe together paved the way for more contemporary theories on intelligence. For example, American psychologist Howard Gardner views intelligence as multiple abilities that come in different forms. He references instances of brain damage where one ability may be destroyed while others stay perfectly intact. Savants usually have some limited mental abilities, but one exceptional ability when it comes to like computing figures or memorizing the complete works of Shakespeare. To Gardner, this suggests that we have multiple intelligences beyond the G factor. In fact, he believes that we have 8 intelligences, ranging from our skills with numbers and words to our ability to understand physical space and the natural world. American psychologist Robert Sternberg tends to agree with Gardner, though he boils them down into 3 intelligences: analytical or problem-solving intelligence, creative intelligence, or the ability to adapt to new situations, and practical intelligence for everyday tasks. Both of these models seem reasonable, too, and Gardner and Sternberg's work has helped teachers appreciate students' variety of talents. But research has suggested that even these different ways to be smart are also linked by some underlying general intelligence factor. So what about other less tangible forms of intelligence like creativity, our ability to produce ideas that are both novel and valuable? How can a test that demands one correct answer account for more creative solutions, so-called divergent thinking? Well, traditional intelligence tests can't, and so far, while we do have some tests that look at creative potential, we don't have a standardized system for quantifying creativity. But Sternberg and his colleagues have identified 5 main components of creativity, which are useful for framing our understanding of what creative intelligence is and how it works. And when you go through the list, you know who I think is really great at almost all of them? Sherlock Holmes. Hear me out. First, we got expertise, or a well-developed base of knowledge. This just means knowing a lot about a lot, whether it's arcane poisons, jellyfish behavior, or how to recognize a secret passage behind a bookshelf. Expertise provides the mind with all sorts of data to work with and combine in new ways. Obviously, Sherlock has incredible imaginative thinking skills too, which provide him with the ability to see things in new ways, recognize patterns, and make connections. He loves nothing more than rehashing these breadcrumb trails for the dopey constables at the end of a case. Sternberg also thought a venturesome personality contributes to creativity. By hanging around opium dens and chasing thugs and generally courting danger, Sherlock routinely seeks new experiences, tolerates risk, and perseveres in overcoming obstacles. And everyone knows he's driven by intrinsic motivation. I mean, he wants to help the widow discover the thief and everything, but really Sherlock is driven by his own interest and sense of challenge. He gets pleasure from the work itself. And finally, Sherlock benefits from a creative environment which sparks, supports, and refines his ideas. For so affectionately maintaining this environment on Sherlock's behalf, we largely have Dr. Watson to thank. Sherlock was...
Okay, so you can see there's an awful lot of I guess, extra things that you can be testing for in intelligence that we're really not testing right now. So they mentioned divergent thinking. And in fact, it is in your textbook for the intelligence test section. You know, it's something we're going to see more and more of. But we need people to actually create those tests. So again, that could be you if you have an interest in research. And of course, we've got things like practical intelligence. So, you know, this is sort of going to more sort of into organisational psychology. Can people do the job or the task that they're being set to? How can we measure that? Well, you saw last week we talked about things like a situational judgment test. We talked about simulations of work behaviour, and we're likely to see many more tests of practical intelligence measuring specific types of skills. Now, the Big Five shape development of a number of assessment measures, but there's going to be new concepts and increased attention driving new measures, because we want to identify what are the things that we're not yet measuring. Things like emotional intelligence, or what Gardner referred to as inter- and intrapersonal intelligence. So, can you recognise facial expressions? Do you have empathy? Can you take someone else's perspective and imagine what they're thinking and feeling? This is a goldmine for new research. And there are so many EI tests coming out, it's not funny. Now, some of them are based on personality traits, like a self-report. Others are actual performance tasks with things like facial recognition, emotional expressions, etc. And so there's a lot of behavioural tests now of emotional intelligence as well. Because sometimes people think they've got insight, but then they really lack it. So we want to know what fosters emotional intelligence. How could we intervene early on, particularly at the level of primary school, to increase emotional intelligence? There's lots of theoretical issues. So how do we measure EI, and where would we put it in that CHC theory? So we'd need to expand it. Would we amalgamate personality traits, or is it more of an intellectual skill? These debates have not yet been settled. And of course, very controversial, can interventions increase EI, or is it something that's fixed and heritable? One other issue is that I did allude to, the difference between a self-report and a behavioural assessment. There's some question as to whether self-reports in EI are really accurate. Okay, other concepts like integrity. Now, I'd like to say we've measured honesty and integrity sufficiently, but they're still prone to social desirability and superlative response styles. So some other indirect ways, perhaps, of measuring integrity. So you might have specific personality tests, or perhaps some direct measures to investigate their honesty, trustworthiness, or integrity. So we need things like unobtrusive measures. So things like typing speed when you're answering your email. Do you slow down and reconsider? That might be useful to an employer. Are you always at your computer? So is the computer ever idle for long? Those would be useful things to know in case you're slacking off. Things like your mouse clicks, your eye tracking. These unobtrusive measures or non-reactive measures might prove useful in doing these types of tests. Then we have new social issues. So this one wasn't here last year. Post-Me Too, we're learning how widespread misconduct may actually be in the workforce and society. I say we're learning. I think a lot of people knew about it before. It doesn't come as much of a surprise to some. But also how ambiguous some social situations can be. So to some people anyway, they lack a perspective-taking, theory of mind. And we have new social issues too and the effects of it. So things like, just off the top of my head, attitudes to women and behaviours. So we just used to measure sexism, or what we call hostile sexism. We also measure benevolent sexism, you know, that patronising, mansplaining type of attitude. That is useful to know about in the workforce as well, because if you've got a sexual harassment problem, if you have your employees or one group of your employees continually feeling undermined, that's not good for productivity. And we have new social issues like I heard the other day about incels, apparently, involuntary celebrants. That's going to be a gold mine for research, what's going on in their little heads. Things like non-consensual image sharing. Why do people do it? There's all these new research questions coming around. Deep faking of audio and video. So you might have seen in the news the footage of Barack Obama saying a speech that he never actually said. It was played by an actor, and an artificial neural network mapped Obama's face onto it and faked the voice. So that sort of undermines our confidence in what we can see, what we can hear, and that will be a very interesting area to research. Okay, so technical and methodological developments. So we've gone through computer-assisted psychological assessment, we've gone through CAT, computer-administered testing, and we've also gone through the use of smartphones for behavioural assessment. But we're now moving to what we call smart testing, where we go beyond just computerised adaptive testing to multidimensional testing. We measure more than one thing. Where we make use of reaction times, so time parameterised testing, where we collect data surreptitiously through games and other activities. So we're measuring latent traits like intelligence, like on a brain training game, but we're not portraying it as an actual test, so it's more subtle. Then, of course, we have the issue of internet testing. All right, so computers have advanced quite a bit. You know, in the 1950s, you had big mainframes like that, size of a room. 1980s, that's when the first psychological tests on computer came out. So the Apple II, you could administer the MMPI, the original one. And you just sit there hitting yes, no, yes, 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 no, no. So that's where it started. But then we had the internet and the idea of online testing. But, of course, not everyone had the internet. Not everyone could afford the internet. So it slowed down our development. But by the 2000s, not only were we able to have the internet, we could have it in our pocket. So that meant I could reach you at any time of the day and get you to fill out maybe one item, a rating from 1 to 5, what your mood is like. So that led to experiential sampling. We tried it earlier with pages, but it didn't really work that well. And in the 2010s, you know, we had the widespread adoption of tablets and laptops. It's at an affordable price point that most people can afford it. Certainly all researchers can afford it. And often it's easier to take the tablet to, let's say someone doesn't have a computer, they're older, they're not familiar with it, you just take the tablet with you when you're visiting them. So it means you can gather data electronically, you don't have to retype it. That led to a reduction in research costs. But it did raise a question. Does computer presentation change the construct that's being measured? So some initial studies said no. What they did was they got people to fill out a survey online and then fill out the same survey on a PC or a laptop or a tablet. And the correlation was pretty strong. So I'm thinking, oh, this is pretty sweet, 0.97, it's exactly the same. The problem is, though, they were with motivated subjects that were supervised and proctored. What happens when you get ordinary people in their own time to fill out a survey? Well, if you're planning on using the student subject pool in your honours, it leads to lower reliability because you don't know whether they're going to be paying attention. In fact, they're probably not. They're half reading it, they're multitasking, maybe they're Netflixing, maybe they're on the phone. That introduces noise into the data. So there's also less rapport because they're only doing it for research participation or out of the goodness of their heart filling out a survey like with your peers. So that makes it very hard to get motivated subjects, particularly for long surveys. So there is that issue of reliability. Another issue is with speeded tests. So when there's a time limit, remember the speed versus power in performance testing? If you see here on the right, we've got the digit symbol task. It's a coding task. If you have a short time limit to do it, it's actually harder to do it on computer than it is paper and pencil. And so there's a lower correlation between the two instruments. There's a lot of extra noise there. Using a pencil is easier than a mouse, and particularly with fine motor skills, particularly in younger kids, you see these gender differences. So they're not always equivalent. Something to be mindful of. But we are increasingly moving to internet testing of intelligence tests. Pearson, rather than sell you a kit that will cost you $3 or $4 grand, they would much rather sell you a license for every person and take a percentage. So increasingly, they're trying to move to internet testing. I'm just going to play just a little bit of effectively it's an advertorial for the WISC. Two iPads talk to each other. Clinician has an iPad as well. They're taking notes during the testing session. And the child just needs to select the stimuli by pressing. Okay, that's enough of that. But it does lead to improved accuracy, because often what happens is you make a mistake when you're doing an intelligence test. And that's why we have the supplementary scales too, as a fallback. If you make a mistake or you forget to record something, you can then go back and substitute it with a supplementary scale. So anything that improves the accuracy and the reliability of testing is probably a good thing. But you still need to supervise the testing session. So that's one of the limitations of testing. You've got to be sure who's actually taking the test. So Kilonen, 1997, suggested that there are 4 areas where we're going to see a lot of growth. So computer delivery, multi-dimensional adaptive testing, things that make use of reaction time, particularly for performance-based tests, and what we call latent factor-centred design. So multidimensional adaptive testing, MAT, it's an extension of computerised adaptive testing, or CAT. Another excuse to have some cat photos. So it's a multivariate generalisation. And we all know what that means, don't we? Oh. So multivariate means multiple variables. So instead of just measuring a single trait or a single ability, we're going to measure several. And we might be alternating between them. Why would we want to do that? Well, it leads to increased efficiency. So CAT, continually monitors performance and sort of identifies what's the optimum difficulty level. It adapts to your ability on that underlying trait to the point where you'd get around about half right and half wrong, and then it stops. CAT measures a single latent trait or ability, but multidimensional, what it does is applies it to a battery of tests. Now, we've talked about cross-battery assessment, particularly for intelligence tests. So if you wanted to do CHC testing, you couldn't do it just with a single test. You need a cross battery. And something like multi-dimensional adaptive testing would be ideally suited to it. Key advantage is that it reduces testing time without sacrificing accuracy. So, for example, the multi-dimensional aptitude battery is one example of an intelligence test, and you can tell it what ones you want to measure, and it will actually go ahead and measure them. And it significantly saves testing time. But you've already seen some MAT examples, even if you don't realise it. So let's go back and have a look at some of the examples. So PISA, Progress in International Student Assessment, already makes use of the MAT technique to measure 3 outcomes: reading literacy, mathematics literacy, and science literacy. We also added a 4th, which is financial literacy, that it now measures. So it switches between those constructs. Now, if it works out that you're already a high ability person, when it switches to the math section, it's not going to give you 7 times 9. It's going to give you a harder question. So it's worked out what your G is and then pitches the difficulty at that. So you can sort of use it for routing. Then there's a NAPLAN Online, which of course is a bit controversial. It measures things like reading, writing, spelling, grammar, and numeracy. And it's doing this online and switching between them. The limitations of MAT are, well, there's a lot more effort to develop them. You need to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items and do those item characteristic curves that we've talked about. You also need data from a large sample of examinees. So that's why one of the arguments for not releasing the NAPLAN Online data yet, because we haven't tested a sufficient number of people to build up our norms. And the norms may well differ between the NAPLAN Online and the regular NAPLAN. Problem, though, is that this chopping and changing between item types, that can be very confusing. You've got to switch the way you're thinking, and that may lead to lower performance. I'm thinking particularly in children, these memory requirements to switch between them may be unrealistic. You may be remembering the previous instructions and get a little confused and a little muddled up. Then we have the issue of time parameterization. To parameterize means to convert it to a number, to estimate it. So how long is your reaction time? Are you using a speed-based approach or slowing down for accuracy? We generally sacrifice one for the other, and that sort of creates challenges in scoring and interpretation. Okay, so I think I might pause there. We'll give you about a 5 or 10 minute break. Then we'll come back, hit it hard, and hopefully get through all this. So I don't want to start the next topic because I've got to play a video, so we'll just pause it for now. Before the break, we were talking about time parameterization. What can we use reaction time for? So we can actually infer underlying inferences about ability based on how long you take to answer a question. So if I give you, let's say it's a visual spatial task, mental rotation, you know, some blocks that are mentally rotating, you've got to pick the right answer. If you take longer, then presumably you're slightly lower in ability than someone who answers it very quickly. So we can actually use time to identify, for example, who's doing a speed approach and who's slowing down, emphasising accuracy. So we can make an inference about their strategy. But we can also do that with personality traits. And this is a really cool one, and I love talking about the implicit association task. So if I were to ask, I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular, I'm just going to point to a vacant chair, but are you racist? You'll say, no, of course I'm not racist, but, and then they'll say a racist thing. So people, or they'll say things like, oh, some of my best friends are. But we all know that there's a lot of prejudice in society, and a lot of people don't admit to racism or prejudice because it's socially undesirable. You know, 50 or 60 years ago, we could get by with a semantic differential rating scale. You saw that one that I showed you about foreigners. People would admit to it proudly. But these days, we're sort of closeted racists. So what you can do is use measures of reaction time to make inferences about attitudes, beliefs, biases. I'm going to show you the IAT. So it was developed by these three, Nosek on the left, Banerjee in the middle, and blanking on the third guy's name. But it's a way to objectively measure people's prejudices that overcomes that limitation of self-report. So, I'm going to show you an interview with Banerjee. It's a really interesting test, and it's something you're going to see more and more of in social psychology, but also in cognitive psychology, organisational psychology, to identify ahead of time who's going to be the sleazy douchebag who's going to get your company sued. So let's have a look at the IAT. After the advertisement.
That's what the test does. You can go visit the test and take tests like things. They're bad things. Words like devil, bomb, war.
Okay, let's get to the right spot.
Awful, failure. These are all bad things. Now, imagine that you're sitting in front of a computer, and I tell you, whenever a face shows up, decide, is it a black face or a white face? If it is white, press this key. If it is black, press this key. Easy. Now, you will also get words and faces. If the word is good, like love, or the face is white, you should press the right key. If the word is bad, like devil, and if the face is black, you should press the left key. Easy. This turns out to be very easy for many people to do. But if I now say switch it, now, if you see a black face or a good word, press the right key. If you see a face that's white and a bad word, you press the left key. Most of us, myself included, we will slow down when we have to do this. What does this tell us? It tells us that in our minds, there is a concept like black and white, like there are many concepts, straight and gay, older and younger person, people who are rich and poor, people who are Russian and American. These are all different categories, many different religions and so on. So you can now take this test. It's called the implicit association test, and it simply measures how fast can you put black and good together compared to how fast you can put white and good together. And it takes the difference in the time and the number of mistakes you make when you do this test as a rough indicator of that idea in your mind and what attitude you have towards it. So the implicit association test simply measures the strength of association between an attribute such as good and bad, tall and short, strong and weak, and many groups that we can imagine, elderly and young, male and female, black and white, gay and straight, whatever it is you're interested in. That's what the test does. You can go visit the test and take tests like this yourself. You can just go to implicit.harvard.edu, and there are many tests there, and anybody who's interested can go to IMPL.
Okay, so that's enough. I just wanted you to have some exposure to the IAT. There's something that will come up. You'll see it more and more in clinical practice. You'll see it more and more mentioned in the media because it's a very useful test. So if you didn't quite understand Banerjee's description, basically you're being showed pictures or words like gay, straight, and you've got to associate it with words like good or bad. And if I'm homophobic and I get shown the word gay or homosexual and the word moral, I'm going to, even though I know I've got to press it, because I've got to pretend to be nice and PC, I'm going to slow down. My mind is resisting it. It causes a conflict. And that conflict is what we're measuring in the delayed reaction time. Or I hit mistake and I hit the wrong key saying it's a bad thing. You know, I let one through to the keeper. And so that's what the IAT is measuring. Now, it's widely used in research in a whole lot of settings, but we're very likely to see it moved into applied psychology. After all, this is the school of applied psychology. Applied psychology is far more important in many ways than just your traditional clinical psychology or the research. So it's free for a start. It's easily administered on computer, and it's a good way of making inferences. So the advantage of the IAT is that it's indirect measurement. So your implicit beliefs may well differ from your explicit or your self-image. I see myself as a good person who's not homophobic, who's not racist, but I might secretly have those prejudices that even I don't let myself be aware of. So it's a good way of testing things like that. And you've probably seen something similar to this a couple of weeks ago, the difference between projective and self-report measures. They frequently differ. So again, it's another way of measuring implicit things rather than explicit beliefs. And the good thing is that means it's less susceptible to what we call a superlative or a socially desirable response style. And the reliability is moderately high. So it's suitable for research, it's suitable for group-based decisions. But some question its legitimacy for individual decision-making, particularly high-stakes testing. One thing is that people can have impaired motor skills, so they do slow down, or it's a bit unreliable, or they might often hit the wrong key. So that might introduce some noise. The question is, might we see IAT used, and it's an ethical issue, as well as a psychometrics issue that psychologists will have to make decisions on. Can we use it in the courtroom, for example, to demonstrate prejudice or bias? So imagine if you're a young black man and you've been alleged to have committed a rather serious crime. You know you're innocent, but what are your chances in rural Queensland of getting an impartial jury? Well, one thing you could do is, as part of Guardia, when you're doing the jury screening, is to administer something like the IAT. If you've already formed up an opinion based on the colour of his skin or what you've heard in the media, then that might be grounds for disqualification, or perhaps even for a sitting judge. Or what about employees in a discrimination lawsuit? They say, no, I'm not prejudiced, but what might the IAT measure? So it's an interesting question. It's not yet at the stage where it's at the reliability and validity for high-stakes decision-making, but we may well see that in the future. Another approach is what we call latent factor-centred design. The idea is that we focus more on the construct being measured than the properties of the test and how we're collecting that data. So rather than just sticking to self-reports, we might look at alternative ways to measure the construct, like the IAT. We might measure it from people playing games. We might measure it from people's behaviour, perhaps their online actions, maybe their, who knows what it would say about you, your browser search history, things like that, to try to infer personality. The problem with the traditional test is that it really resembles that paper and pencil test. It's high stakes and creates test anxiety. And that's not a good thing because you don't get an accurate measurement. Whereas if you look at other ways of getting data, so you might use things like virtual reality, role play, or maybe some games that sort of surreptitiously score and collect data, like a brain training game, then you might be able to gather a whole lot of information. In fact, there are a lot of brain training games out there that actually are set up by researchers, and they're just collecting that data to do research on. So it's an interesting way of getting at the latent factor underneath and ignoring the way that you're collecting the data. Of course, then we've got internet testing, and that leads nicely into it. So it revolutionised testing. It had a large impact on the distribution of tests, more so than the development. So how do we get that test out to someone? They can be circulated to psychologists and other end users very, very easily. I just send you a link in an email or text or an SMS, and you fill out the survey online on your iPhone. So it's a good way of collecting data, fast, quick and easy. Because it's all computer scored, it's not hand scored, you get the data earlier. And what you can do, particularly if you're developing a new test, you can have what they call dynamic norming. So as more and more participants complete it, the norms tables update automatically. Do you remember how involved it was to do your norms tables in the assignment? Well, imagine a computer doing that instantly every time someone submits a response. So particularly early in scale development, that would be very, very useful. And then you can identify, for example, items with a poor discrimination index. So we're very likely to see in the future multidimensional, adaptive, time parameterised, latent factor centred and dynamically normed tests. Combine them all together. Now, of course, internet testing, it does raise some risks and limitations, particularly for high-stakes testing. So we've got there on the right Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and at the bottom, the most basic human need of all above air, shelter, water, food, sleep, maybe even sex, is the internet. But of course, not everybody has the internet. There will be people here in this room, for example, that don't have Facebook. Maybe they don't have a smartphone, they're still using a Nokia. Maybe they don't have internet at home or even a computer at home. We have some students like that. So you can't always assume that your participants are going to have access to the internet and be able to fill out your survey. And particularly we're talking about rural and regional areas. So if you're trying to move to online testing, that presents a difficulty. There will be some people you cannot get to, and so you won't truly have a normative, nationally representative sample. And there's risks and limitations. So one thing, if we administer a survey online, well, people can take a copy of it. Probably not such a bad thing, but what if we were administering a test online? Let's say it's a vocabulary test and you memorise what the questions are. You can coach the next person along to actually do better on the test. So the answers might get out there. The MMPI and the MMPI-2 are good examples where the test data, the test questions are out there, people can be coached to present it. You know, a rosy picture or perhaps to fake bad. And we might disable print and screen capture, but you can't stop someone taking a photograph with a digital camera. And of course, you've got bandwidth limitation, particularly if you're going to do something really advanced like virtual reality or streaming video or video conferencing. that can be an issue. And not everyone has that capabilities yet. They might in the future, but not right now. Another risk is the proliferation of non-evidence-based assessments on the internet. So pop psych and parapsychological tests, it's a major problem for the field because it reduces our credibility. You know, every time you see a Which Games of Thrones character you test, if that's what people think of psychology and personality, heaven help us. And the other problem too with testing versus assessment, internet testing is suited to testing, it's not suited to assessment. So you can't capture that extra test behaviour, which is oh so crucial. Even with video conferencing, you're probably only seeing the head or the top half, so you're not seeing the rest of the person. And there's a risk, and this is an ethical issue, of it being used inappropriately for psychological assessment. So just based on, you know, just a quick 5-minute session making an interpretation. Now, if it's a test of ability, we can get around that by having what we call supervised testing. So if I'm proctoring it, I can authenticate the test taker. I know who you are because you show me your driver's license. I can establish rapport, make you feel relaxed and comfortable, reduce your anxiety, put you at ease. That increases your motivation, particularly if it's a survey or a high-stakes test that's really useful. I can ensure that the test is administered according to the manual, so we have standardisation across settings. I can also prevent you from cheating, pulling out a cheat list of how to answer the MMPI. And this is also important. In fact, we did this in the mid-trimester exam. We collected all your exam papers up. So that ensures the security of the test itself. Without supervised testing, you cannot be guaranteed of that. And of course, there's different levels of supervision. There's the unsupervised, where, you know, tests are published online. There's the controlled. So let's say you're doing a survey and we email you and we give you a password to log in. Only you have that password. So that's one way of restricting access. So only people who are invited can complete the test. We might have a supervised mode, so we have a presence of a proctor. They might not be very well trained. They might not know what the test is about. Then we have the managed mode, where we have sort of formal exam conditions and the test is kept secure. All right. But people are hacked all the time. They're prone. So these tests will still get out there. And if you don't have good test security, I could go in and I could change my answers, change my score. And that is a very serious threat to the validity of tests. So one thing, it puts the onus on you as a psychological professional. Make sure that your tests are kept secured, that you don't allow access to just anyone, and that those answers in particular are stored securely. So why does supervision matter? Well, tests of typical performance, like a personality and interest inventory, tend to not really be affected by the lack of supervision. It doesn't really matter. It's not high-stakes tests. There's not any real consequences. But when we go to high stakes, so we're looking for tests of maximal performance, like an aptitude test or an achievement, or maybe a forensic psychology test like the MMPI, then that really matters. So the answers are impacted by either the presence or the absence of a proctor. So you've got the potential to look up answers, phone a friend, Google, and that tends to inflate your test scores. Whoop, too far. So what technology might be used in the future? we might be collecting cognitive information from games or perhaps personality. Might be looking at eye tracking, mobile phones, smartphones, wearables. Now, some people have even suggested you use virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and holograms. Now, when I took up this course 3 years ago, there was a whole section about how wonderful the world will be about virtual reality, and we'll have AI replacing our psychologists. And it was just pie in the sky stuff. It was written by someone who didn't really, almost like you looked up Wikipedia about some of these topics. So, although these are important to know about, you should also be rightly sceptical about some of them. And there's a lot of problems and issues that still need to be resolved that psychologists have the opportunity to contribute to. So we'll go through some of them. So virtual reality, so we've all seen pictures of someone sitting there with a camera on their face or a headset. It sounds very good. It was once a pipe dream, but it now shows some potential. So it was previously cost prohibitive. You know, it would cost thousands and thousands of dollars for the headset. And, you know, that made it unaffordable, sort of outside the research setting. But now, everybody has a smartphone. And Google Cardboard, come up, there we go, means with a cardboard box, I can place this phone in front of me and turn it into a headset. You know, for $50, $100, we've got our VR headset now. And it actually works better in some ways than some of the more sophisticated, expensive ones, because the more realistic you get, you have an increased risk of things like cyber sickness. So there's a potential for use in org-psych with situational judgment tests, for role play to assess personality, obviously extinction treatment for phobia, so whatever your feared object is, it's less confronting to interact with it, and if it's a picture or a virtual environment, you know intellectually that you're not going to get killed. Your limbic system and your amygdala, the fear centre of the brain, it won't know the difference. And so extinction it's really useful for. Social anxiety is less confronting if you know that it's an AI or an NPC in a game. So why aren't we using it more often? Well, here's the reason why. It's a very sad and cruel condition. So have you heard of cyber sickness after you've played a virtual reality game? So it needs to be accessible to all persons, and currently it is not. So cyber sickness is very debilitating. So at the moment, you only have it when people are voluntarily playing games. But if you're forcing people to do an assessment or to do an extinction therapy, you're going to pick up a lot of people who don't play games and who will be susceptible to cyber sickness. They will get nauseous. They will be dizzy. They will be throwing up. They will get splitting migraines. And we've known about this for 50, 60 years, since we first had flight simulators. So it results in extreme headaches, nausea, disorientation, so you're not quite aware of what's going on, and that's a particularly serious factor if it's a performance-based task. We have cognitive impairments and also an inability to regulate body temperature. So it's not just a psychological condition, it's a neurological condition. It's very similar to car sickness. So has anyone ever got motion sickness on a boat? You know, it's a very similar feeling. In fact, most people who develop cyber sickness, they also have susceptibility to motion sickness. But it's far more debilitating. The prevalence is anywhere between 10 to 15 or 20% of the population. And these are usually people who aren't playing games, so they don't even know they've got it yet. But if you find that, you know, 10%, even just 10% can't use your test, that's a really serious issue. And unfortunately, there's no known cure other than benzodiazepines like alprazolam, Valium, and even then they have to be administered prophylactically, and some anti-epileptic medication can help as well. We've got a question up the back. Do I know why it happens? Well, if I knew why it happens, I would be able to work on solutions to treat it. I don't know why, and we currently don't. We know there's a link to the vestibular system in your ear. You see the motion and the movement, but your ear is telling you that you're not moving. And that conflict is believed to be one of the causes. But we don't really know why it affects some people and not others. Now, a little confession time, I actually tend to suffer for it as well. And I'm a huge gamer. But there are many games I just can't play. Anything from a first-person perspective, you know, just can't play it. I would kill to be able to do it. So gaming companies are investing big bucks into research. Nintendo, Sony, Electronic Arts would pay a fortune. They would pay billions for the cure. And if a pharmaceutical company ever comes up with a treatment, there will be people lining up to take their drug. But I rather suspect it'll be other factors. So if we can identify what about the images is affecting it, so frame rate, flicker, those sorts of things. There are game designers who are sort of working on that sort of research to try to minimise it. But because it's such a serious and debilitating health condition, DARPA in America, which is the Defence Advanced Research something agency, what they do is they're investing millions and millions into this because they need to be able to train their soldiers in simulations of combat without actually getting them killed in live fire exercises. So there's a significant amount of money being invested in it. But we haven't found a cure. So that's a bit of a problem for VR. So it's something that they don't often talk about. If you read a book about how wonderful VR will be, they don't also mention some of the drawbacks. And it's something that cognitive psychologists are working on. Okay, another issue is believability of interactions. So what we will want to know is if we have a personality assessment of how you interact with people, are you going to believe that the people you're interacting are real? Or will you just treat them as NPCs? And will this translate to offline behaviour? So if you're violent and homicidal towards NPCs in a game, what does that tell me about your personality? Are you antisocial? Probably not. It's just you're not treating it as real. So there's a believability issue there. And another issue too is the believability, particularly with sort of situational judgment tests and simulations and role play. It's often lacking in what we call photorealism. You know it's artificial, the stimuli. So even if it's off slightly, the faces, it just doesn't register as real. So we have what we call the uncanny valley effect. So that's an unsettling feeling that people have when they view androids or virtual reality simulations, and it just feels wrong and creepy, and you know it's artificial. So they're not convincingly realistic. And why do we call it the uncanny valley? It's a strange cognitive effect. As if we put on the x-axis here from very mechanical like this to very human like this. As we move towards the more human, we start to increase our liking and acceptance of that person. Then it becomes creepy and we see this dip. And the more human it becomes, the more we hate it. So that's what we call the uncanny valley. So if we look at that face and then look at that one, which do you like more? Well, the one that looks like an android, it's just not quite right. So that's another problem too for VR interactions with people. And of course there's acceptance testing by users. Like all new technology, will it be accepted? So young gamers are probably going to accept it. What about older people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s? How are they going to react to it? And so this sort of question of, will they be accepting of this type of testing? And then there's artificial intelligence. Again, it's making some progress, but if you ever use little Siri here, she's pretty dumb. And she's not very good with Australian accents. At least she isn't with mine. So they're very limited at the moment. Things like visual perception, they're very good at. Speech recognition, maybe not quite so much. You can't carry on a conversation with Siri, not really. It's just faking it. But chat conversations are getting better and better. So I got there a picture of Eliza, who was the very first online, well, it was offline, it was in the 60s and 70s, before the internet, but it was the first computer-administered chat session, back when we thought talking therapy was the solution for psychological issues. We didn't know that you need skilled people to talk with, and we thought just expressing yourself verbally would be enough. So you would have a chat session, and it would basically parrot back everything you said. So if you said, I'm having a bad day, it would ask, why do you think you're having a bad day? What's going on there? And then you'd talk about it, and it would interpret it. And it was originally designed as a substitute for a psychotherapist. But she parroted back. Now, the holy grail of AI is to be able to develop a chat session where the person on the other end, the human, never knows whether they're talking to a computer or to a person. It's able to interpret their conversation and have a decent-sized conversation. So that's what we call the Turing test. We're getting closer and closer to it, but we still don't have it yet. So the good news is your jobs as counsellors are secure, at least for the next 10 years. So after 60 years of thinking it's just 5 or 10 years away, no one has been able to create an AI that'll pass the Turing test. And it's been suggested things like holograms. Well, you remember R2-D2 from Star Wars? Help me, Obi-Wan, you're my only hope. Very little progress has actually been made. So they're incredibly expensive, incredibly limited, and they're just not ready for the consumer markets. But what we will see, and we see now, are games. And there's a lot of brain training games that actually collect this data surreptitiously. There are some games that have diagnostic tests. So, for example, things like the whack-a-mole, it's a nice way of measuring fine motor skill and also cognitive assessment. So if we tell them to whack the mole but not the rabbit, and they can't help but hitting the rabbit as well, then that tells me something about their ability to inhibit responses. So there's a whole lot of games being used as assessment now. So they're being developed other than for the primary purpose of entertainment. Then there's eye tracking. One of our lecturers here, Matt Stainer, loves eye tracking, and also David Newman as well. They've been using eye tracking data for many years to study things like literacy and cognitive processes. Now, eye trackers used to be really, really expensive, but it's now getting cheaper and cheaper. So you can place, instead of wearing a headset, you can place a little camera there, And with the right software, you can actually, looking at the video feed, you can actually see where the pupil's moving and track them. It's not quite as good as, the more expensive commercial eye trackers, but it's enough for research and for basic diagnostics. So I rather anticipate there'll be a time when you say, hey Siri, and you're looking into it, and it's actually tracking your eyes as well. It's a good way...
I like these arbitrary categories.
Thank you, Siri. It's a good way of what we call unobtrusive or non-reactive data collection. And of course, mobile phones. We've got things like GPS, accelerometers, Google Maps. Whenever I go up to Brisbane, I put Google Maps on and it remembers where I parked my car. Now, I don't have to tell it where I parked. It notices that the accelerometer was driving and then suddenly it's walking space. So it infers that I've parked my car there. So those sorts of things we're getting used to now, but we'll see new and new sensors put on these smartphones, things like temperature, heart rate, etc. Now, the application of artificial intelligence, not for the purpose of communicating, but behind the scenes, it can be applied to processing audio and video data. And it's already leading to non-reactive and unobtrusive measures. So it uses things called an artificial neural network. That's basically like the brain with lots of simulated neurons, and they interlink and they have layers. And it uses it to process audio and video. And it's a good way to conduct psychophysiological measurement of processes by stealth without you even being aware of it. So you remember last week I went through plethysmography? Well, we have this new word, photoplethysmography, where we can actually measure your heart rate simply by using a camera. Now, I'm not talking really sophisticated infrared stuff here. I'm talking about your normal phone camera. So you can analyse an incoming video feed or still photos from cameras, and it can detect minute changes and fluctuations in heat that are not visible to the human eye. Why would we care about heat? Well, remember last week I talked about in a counselling session, you might be measuring blood flow, for example. Well, if you notice that there are changes in blood flow, you can make an inference about the heart rate. So every time your heart beats, the amount of blood that reaches the capillaries in your fingers and your face, it swells and then recedes, swells and then recedes. And because blood absorbs light, neural networks are able to capture this ebb and flow using the flash of your phone's camera to illuminate the skin and create a reflection. There's no need for infrared vision. It's smart enough to do it without it. So we have the example, visual heart rate estimation with a neural network. So there are apps already that will do it, but there's more sophisticated neural networks who can do it as part of a psychological assessment. So we've got an example here, someone working out, and it can actually, it's trained with that person's heart rate. You train the network up, then we show them video of that person, and it can create an estimate of what their heart rate is like. So if it's increasing, they're more likely stressed or worried or anxious. A bit like the lie detector, the polygraph. So this is a very relatively innocuous use in research, but how could we apply this technology to things like heart rate monitoring and psychological assessment? So you're not really aware it's happening, it's just part of the normal testing session. If I were to ask you to put on a heart rate monitor, that's obtrusive monitoring. This is truly non-obtrusive. Then we have emotional state recognition. So another advancement is a degree of sophistication and accuracy in emotional state recognition. Am I happy? Am I sad? Those micro expressions that humans are not very good at picking up on, that body language, it can actually create an estimate of it. This would be really good for someone who is autistic and can't read facial expressions if they had a little earpiece that would provide them with that information. It would also be useful in psychological research, but also forensic psychology, so looking at video footage. So it can record emotions and temporary states from photo and video. And the idea is that a personal AI like Siri could adapt to suit your mood. Now, if Siri is bright and happy and I'm a bit gloomy, maybe Siri can give me a little bit of a nudge towards that happy range. Maybe it can tell me a corny joke, make me laugh. So these sorts of things are going to become more widely spread. It will be a form of psychological assessment. It could track your moods over the day. And it could be used for automated assessment or perhaps for use in forensic cases. So if I have a look at video footage of the person going to the apartment, is he already angry and stirred up? Well, if he is, and we can demonstrate it, not so good for him if he's trying to argue it wasn't premeditated. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision to kill his partner. Well, things like emotional state recognition would be very useful in those sorts of situations. But we need psychologists to work along with technologists to make it happen. So again, growth industry and certainly good opportunities for jobs. So we need more psych-literate peeps in doing this type of research. Of course, mobile phones, which we've talked about quite extensively, can be used for what we call ecological momentary assessment in real time. And it's well accepted by clients, like psychiatric patients, and it's user-friendly. So we'll see more and more of these. Then, of course, we have wearables. So I mentioned the EEG, it's not very portable, but EEGs have been clumsy, expensive. Not only is it affordable for the individual, it's now becoming fashionable. So when I did the slides last year, it was $799 for the emotive headset. It's now $299. Now, if you think how much you paid for your last phone, this is starting to look more affordable. By the way, there's US prices for anyone who wants one. But, you know, it's incredible technology, and it brings EEG out of the lab with new opportunities for psychological assessment. So a possibility for emotional dysregulation, attention deficit, etc. So there's a picture of the emotive headset that you can wear. You can take it out into the field. So you have ecological validity for your personality and cognitive tests. You can use it in educational settings. So to identify who's paying attention and who is not. Maybe it gives you a subtle prompt. It gives you an electric shock every time you stare out the window. But you can imagine how that might be really useful for educational assessment, to identify who really does have that attention deficit disorder and who has slipped under the cracks and not been diagnosed. Then there's contextual changes. You know, no one can predict what the future will be. So the only thing that we as psychological practitioners and researchers and mental health workers and forensic officers and social workers can do is fall back on our code of ethics. That will present new ethical challenges and dilemmas, but it's important that we do hold true to our ethical principles. Okay, particularly for the future of assessment. You know, there will be new technologies come along, but we've got to critically evaluate it and question the psychometrics. Okay, so the end of trimester exam is coming up. So you have about 3 weeks. Ooh. It is Tuesday, October the 15th, don't forget. Now, it is staggered, though, across 2 different times. We couldn't fit everyone in. Not my choice. I would have had it at the same time. And it's even worse at Mount Gravatt. I think they've got 3 versions. So at 8 a.m. and 11:30. But the buildings are different. I think the 8 a.m. is here. But check your personal timetable to find out which one you've been allocated to. It's really important you go to the right one and check it before the exam date, just in case it does change. If you have an alternate exam scheduled, your location will be different, so you do need to check this. Now, it'll be a 2-hour exam. You can write on the paper during perusal. It's 10 minutes perusal. I've said not permitted. It is actually permitted, but I decided not to actually do any calculation questions. So that might reassure you. You don't really need your calculator. It's worth 40% of the final grade. Good news is it's not worth 50%. All that hard work that you went through with the assignment pays off because you don't have half your grade riding on that final test. I'm not a big fan of high-stakes testing because there's a lot of people with test anxiety and it really affects their performance. Now, while obviously I'm motivated out of compassion, I want to get their true score as well. And test anxiety interferes with that. So hopefully having less riding on it, it'll lower that anxiety. There's a multiple choice component. You'll have 60 questions and it's around 60 minutes. And there's also a short answer component, 20%. Now, there's 6 questions, you choose 4. It's up to you which you choose. Obviously, you choose the ones that you think you can answer best, but entirely up to you. And allocate about 15 minutes each. The content will be weeks 6 to 12 primarily, but there might be some concepts from the first half of the semester. There's practice questions given at the end of each lecture, and this tutorial will give you a practice exam, 25 multiple choice and 1 short answer. Deferred exam, make sure you see the policy on it. If you fail, in the unlikely event that you fail the course, you will be granted a supplementary, but only if you've submitted all your assessment items. Okay, so the readings for this week, I've got some particular ones that deal with this content, but any of the content that I just talked about, a future of assessment, is accessible. So please make sure you have a look through it. If there's anything that's unclear, please ask. Now, if I've given page ranges in the lecture, probably a good idea to read them as well. So I've got some revision questions there. I'll leave you to have a look at them. But we do have an urgent request. Teaching evaluations start this week. So feedback, either for good or for ill, would be greatly appreciated. So if your lecturer turns up drunk and is mean and nasty, we need to hear. Similarly for your tutors. In particular, it's nice to know whether having that extra week, we put it back to week 11, was helpful. Now, I knew I would take a hit on the course evaluations because one of the questions is, what was your feedback like? And you won't have gotten that by the time you completed the survey. But we did that so that you had that extra week up your sleeve for completing the assignment. Hopefully that was useful, but keep in mind feedback encompasses all the feedback, email, verbal correspondence with your tutor, asking for help, those sorts of things as well. Now the tutors, they need feedback, either good or bad. If you've had a good tutor, let them know. If you had a bad tutor, let the uni know too. Okay? So it's your opportunity to have a say. Remember that just like any research study, sample size matters. So please do complete your survey, obviously for all your courses, but if you're just going to do one, do it for this. Now, assignment marking. We're going to put in lots of comments. So please do take the time to read it. We put lots of extra time over and above in the marking. Now, tutors will hold an extra consult when the assignments are released to discuss the assignment. No one should walk away not knowing why they got the mark that they did. So please do come in and see your tutor. So, this draws us to the end. It's been a lovely experience teaching you all. For many of you for up to 3 years since first year. So I really have enjoyed it very much. This may be my last time teaching this course here. So it's been lovely to see you all. And I hope you really kick ass on the exam. Thank you. And hopefully I'll still see some of you around. But thank you very much. Best of luck with the exam. If you're still completing the assignment, please come see me in console after the lecture.